I let my cheating wife plan her dream wedding with her affair partner, then exposed them at the altar. 6 months ago, I discovered my wife was having an affair with her coworker from the marketing department. The discovery happened in the most mundane way possible. I was using her laptop to check my email because mine was updating, and a notification popped up from a messaging app I didn't recognize. The preview showed enough to make my stomach drop. Heart pounding, I opened the conversation and found months of intimate messages, photos, and plans for secret meetups. My first instinct was to confront her immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe some deeper part of me knew that a direct confrontation would just lead to denials, gaslighting, and a messy divorce where I'd lose half of everything we'd built together. Instead, I quietly took screenshots of everything and began documenting their relationship. Over the following weeks, I watched my wife of 8 years transform before my eyes. She became more secretive with her phone, started working late more often, and began talking about wanting to redecorate the house. She seemed happier, more energetic, and I realized with a bitter irony that her affair was actually improving our marriage from her perspective. She was getting her emotional and physical needs met elsewhere, which made her more pleasant to be around at home. The breaking point came when I overheard her on a phone call in the garage, thinking I was asleep. She was talking to her sister about how she was planning to leave me but wanted to wait until after the holidays because she didn't want to ruin everyone's Christmas. She mentioned that her affair partner had already started looking at apartments and that they were discussing moving in together. That night, lying in bed next to someone who was mentally planning her exit strategy, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting her or filing for divorce, I was going to let her continue her charade while I planned something much more elaborate. The next morning, I started acting like the most supportive husband in the world. When she mentioned wanting to redecorate, I enthusiastically agreed and suggested we start with a complete renovation of the living room. When she talked about feeling stressed at work, I encouraged her to take more time for herself and even suggested she should go out more often with her friends. I was essentially giving her more freedom to continue her affair while I gathered evidence and formulated my plan. 3 months into my surveillance operation, something unexpected happened. My wife came home one evening with an unusual glow about her, and over dinner, she started talking about marriage in general terms. She asked hypothetical questions about what makes a good wedding, whether I thought people should have big ceremonies or small intimate ones, and what I thought about destination weddings. At first, I thought she was just making conversation, but then she mentioned that her coworker had recently gotten engaged. That's when the pieces clicked together. I realized she wasn't just planning to leave me, she was planning to marry her affair partner. The renovation of our house, the increased attention to her appearance, the sudden interest in wedding planning, it all made sense. She was preparing for her new life while still living in our old one. I decided to test my theory. Over the next few weeks, I started dropping hints about how I thought she deserved the wedding of her dreams, how I regretted that our own wedding had been so small and simple, and how I wished I could give her the fairy tale ceremony she'd always wanted. I watched her face light up whenever I mentioned weddings, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. The breakthrough came when I suggested that we should renew our vows. I told her that I'd been thinking about how much our relationship had grown and changed over the years, and that I wanted to celebrate that with a ceremony that really reflected who we'd become. I said I wanted to plan something special, something that would be the wedding she'd always dreamed of but never had. Her reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. She was initially surprised, then excited, then almost manic with enthusiasm. She started talking about venues, flowers, guest lists, and all the details she'd apparently been thinking about for months. She mentioned specific preferences that seemed oddly detailed for someone who was supposedly just brainstorming, and I realized she'd already been planning this wedding, just not with me as the groom. Over the following days, I watched her struggle with an internal conflict. She wanted the big wedding, but she also wanted it with her affair partner. I could see her trying to figure out how to navigate this situation, and I decided to make it easy for her. I told her that I wanted her to plan everything exactly as she wanted it, that money was no object, and that she should create the wedding of her absolute dreams without any compromises. The transformation was immediate. She threw herself into wedding planning with an intensity that was both impressive and heartbreaking. She spent hours researching venues, looking at dresses, creating Pinterest boards, and talking to vendors. She approached it like it was her job, working on it every evening and weekend, often staying up late into the night perfecting details. As the weeks passed, I started noticing changes in her behavior that suggested she was sharing these plans with someone else. She would get excited about certain decisions, then suddenly become secretive about them. She would start to tell me about a particular vendor or venue, then catch herself and change the subject. She was clearly coordinating with her affair partner, probably showing him pictures and getting his input on decisions. The most telling moment came when she was trying on wedding dresses. She'd asked me to come with her to the bridal salon, and I agreed, curious to see how she would handle the situation. As she tried on different gowns, the consultant kept asking her questions about her vision for the wedding, what her fiancé preferred, and what kind of ceremony they were planning. I watched my wife's face as she answered these questions, and I could see her mentally substituting her affair partner for me in every scenario. When she found the dress she wanted, her reaction was pure joy followed immediately by what looked like panic. She loved the dress, but she was clearly imagining herself wearing it for someone else. She told the consultant she needed to think about it, but I could see in her eyes that she'd already made her decision. I told her that if she loved it, she should get it, and that we could figure out the details later. That evening, she spent hours on the phone with someone, speaking in hushed tones in the backyard. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to understand that she was describing the dress and the venue to her affair partner. She was planning their wedding while married to me, and she was doing it with my full financial support and enthusiastic encouragement. The next phase of my plan required more patience than I thought I possessed. I continued to be the supportive husband, agreeing to every expense, every detail, every decision she made. I met with vendors, signed contracts, and paid deposits, all while watching my wife plan her future with another man. The guest list was particularly interesting. She invited all of our mutual friends and family, but I noticed she was also including people I didn't recognize, presumably friends and family of her affair partner. As the wedding date approached, I started noticing increased anxiety in my wife. She was excited about the wedding, but clearly stressed about the logistics of her situation. She was trying to figure out how to transition from being married to me to being married to her affair partner, and the complexity of that transition was starting to overwhelm her. The month before the wedding, I made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing the vendor contracts, I found a receipt for a men's wedding ring that wasn't mine. The ring was clearly intended for her affair partner, and seeing that receipt made the reality of the situation hit me in a way that all the messages and secret phone calls hadn't. She wasn't just planning to leave me, she was planning to marry someone else at the ceremony I was paying for. That night, I made a decision that would require perfect timing and nerves of steel. I was going to let the wedding proceed exactly as planned, but I was going to make sure that the truth came out in the most dramatic way possible. I started making my own preparations, gathering evidence, and planning exactly how I wanted the revelation to unfold. The week before the wedding, my wife's behavior became increasingly erratic. She was barely sleeping, constantly checking her phone and having hushed conversations at all hours. She was clearly coordinating with her affair partner about the final details, probably figuring out how to execute their plan. I assumed they were planning for him to object during the ceremony, or perhaps they were going to stage some kind of dramatic interruption. 2 days before the wedding, I discovered what they were actually planning. I found a draft email on her laptop that she'd apparently written to send to me after the ceremony. The email explained that she'd realized during the wedding planning process that she was in love with someone else, and that she couldn't go through with marrying me. She apologized for the timing but said she had to follow her heart. Their plan was actually more elaborate than I'd imagined. They were going to let the entire ceremony proceed right up until the moment when the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union. Her affair partner was going to stand up and declare his love for her. She was going to dramatically choose him over me, and they were going to leave together while I was left standing at the altar in front of all our friends and family. The audacity of their plan was breathtaking. They were going to use our wedding as the stage for their romantic declaration, turning what should have been the most important day of our marriage into the public announcement of their affair. They were going to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew, and they were going to make it look like a spontaneous decision driven by true love. But I had different plans. On the morning of the wedding, I woke up early and made a series of phone calls. I called the venue coordinator, the photographer, the videographer, and the officiant. I explained to each of them that there was going to be a special surprise during the ceremony, and that I needed them to be prepared for something unexpected. I told them to keep recording no matter what happened, and that everything would become clear during the reception. As I got ready for the ceremony, I felt surprisingly calm. I'd been planning for this moment for months, and I was finally going to get the resolution I'd been working toward. I put on my tuxedo, straightened my tie, and headed to the venue with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The ceremony was beautiful. My wife looked stunning in her wedding dress, and I could see the joy in her eyes as she walked down the aisle. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for what I was about to do. But then I remembered the months of deception, the lies, the secret planning, and the humiliation they'd intended for me. The officiant began the ceremony with the standard opening remarks. My wife and I exchanged vows that she'd written specifically for this moment, and I have to admit that her words were beautiful and moving. She talked about love, commitment, and building a future together. She talked about the importance of honesty and trust in a marriage. She talked about how excited she was to begin this new chapter of our lives. As the ceremony progressed, I could see her affair partner in the audience, sitting in the back row just as I'd expected. He was wearing a dark suit and had a nervous expression on his face. I could see him checking his watch and glancing around the room, clearly preparing for his moment to interrupt the proceedings. When the officiant reached the part about objections, I felt my heart rate increase. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The officiant asked if anyone present knew of any reason why we should not be joined in marriage, and I could see the affair partner starting to stand up. But before he could speak, I stepped forward and addressed the crowd myself. I thanked everyone for coming to celebrate what I called the most important day of my life. I talked about how much the support of our friends and family meant to us, and how grateful I was that they were there to witness this moment. I said that before we continued with the ceremony, I wanted to share something special with everyone. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder of screenshots I'd been collecting for months. I announced that I wanted to show everyone exactly what kind of love and commitment we were celebrating today. I started reading selected messages from the affair between my wife and her coworker, complete with dates and timestamps. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see the blood draining from my wife's face as she realized what was happening. Her affair partner had gone completely pale and was looking around the room like he was trying to find an escape route. The guests were sitting in stunned silence, trying to process what they were hearing. I continued reading messages, including ones where they discussed their plans for the wedding, their intention to humiliate me, and their excitement about starting their new life together. I read messages where they laughed about how naive I was, how easy it was to manipulate me, and how they couldn't wait to see my face when they revealed their affair. When I finished reading, I looked directly at my wife and told her that I wanted to thank her for planning such a beautiful wedding. I said that she'd put so much thought and effort into every detail, and that it was exactly the kind of ceremony she deserved. I told her that I was happy she'd found someone who made her feel so passionate and alive, and that I wanted her to be with the person who truly made her happy. Then I turned to the crowd and announced that while this wasn't going to be the wedding ceremony we'd originally planned, it was going to be a celebration of honesty and new beginnings. I said that instead of exchanging vows with someone who had been lying to me for months, we were going to have a party to celebrate the end of our marriage and the beginning of whatever came next. The reaction from the crowd was mixed. Some people looked angry, others looked shocked, and a few looked like they were trying not to laugh. My wife's family was clearly mortified, while my own family looked like they were proud of me for standing up for myself. The affair partner had quietly slipped out of the room at some point during my speech, leaving my wife standing alone at the altar. My wife tried to speak, but I held up my hand and told her that she'd already said everything she needed to say in her messages. I told her that I wasn't angry anymore, that I was actually grateful she'd shown me who she really was, and that I was looking forward to moving on with my life. I announced to the crowd that the bar was open, the food was paid for, and that everyone was welcome to stay and celebrate whatever they wanted to celebrate. I said that I was going to change out of my tuxedo and join them for what I hoped would be a memorable evening. As I walked down the aisle, I could hear conversations breaking out all around the room. Some people were clearly discussing what they'd just witnessed, others were trying to comfort my wife, and a few were already heading toward the bar. I felt a sense of freedom and relief that I hadn't experienced in months. The reception turned out to be one of the most interesting parties I'd ever attended. About half of the guests stayed, and while the atmosphere was definitely unusual, people seemed to be enjoying themselves. Several people approached me throughout the evening to tell me they respected what I'd done, and that they couldn't believe what my wife had been planning. My wife left the venue about an hour after the ceremony ended, still in her wedding dress. I heard later that she went to her affair partner's apartment, but that he wasn't there. Apparently, the public exposure of their relationship had been too much for him, and he decided that he wasn't ready for the level of commitment and drama that came with being with her. Over the following weeks, I filed for divorce and began the process of rebuilding my life. The story of our wedding spread quickly through our social circle, and while some people thought I'd been too harsh, most people seemed to understand why I'd handled things the way I did. Several friends told me they'd suspected something was going on but hadn't known how to approach me about it. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly smooth. My wife didn't contest anything, and I think she was just grateful that I wasn't pursuing any kind of public humiliation beyond what had already happened. We divided our assets fairly, and I was able to keep the house since she said she wanted to start fresh somewhere else. The most unexpected outcome was the impact the story had on other people. Several friends reached out to tell me that my situation had prompted them to have difficult conversations with their own partners about honesty and commitment. A few people said that seeing what had happened to us had motivated them to work harder on their own relationships. Looking back, I don't regret the way I handled the situation. Could I have confronted my wife earlier and avoided the elaborate deception? Probably. But I think the way things unfolded gave me a sense of closure and control that I wouldn't have had with a more conventional approach. I was able to turn what was supposed to be the most humiliating moment of my life into something that felt like a victory. The wedding that was supposed to be the beginning of my wife's new life with her affair partner ended up being the public end of their relationship and the beginning of my own journey towards something better. Sometimes the most dramatic solutions are the ones that provide the most satisfying resolution, even if they're not the most conventional or mature approaches to dealing with betrayal.